Now, we have a panel of Peter, Jeff, and Marshall. There is no moderator, so I told them I was going to keep a microphone in the crowd, and if it gets unruly, then I will step in as moderator. But please welcome our co-host for the day.
Thank you, Dave, and thank you, everyone. This is a tremendous day for us, and we know how far people have traveled, and how much they're taking of their time and their resources to be here. And again, I'll echo Dave with a special thanks to the IDE members and our Platform Summit sponsors. Days like today wouldn't be possible without that, and honestly, the research agenda that Dave laid out would not be possible without the generous support of numerous firms, foundations, and individuals. And to give you an idea, I mean, one of the reasons that today is such a special day for us is that as academics, we try to be very rigorous in our thinking, in our hypotheses. We try to have testable sort of theories and then gather the data to see whether they pan out or not. But that's only half the story. The other part that a day like today plays is to make sure that what we're doing has relevance in practice. And it's that interaction with firms that we do throughout the course of our careers, day in, day out, that really makes this possible. And so having you here and the ability to have the back and forth is just terrific. So as Dave said, we've got a great program, and it ranges from machine learning to financial services to Internet of Things, and we'll have a lot of chance to have back and forth. I don't have the clicker, so if somebody can move that forward. Ooh. All right, so as Dave said, there's the panel, and we have a few themes. The idea of this panel for the summit chairs is to just try to set the stage for the day and to talk a little bit about what we've seen over the past 12 months, 18 months, and maybe project a little bit into the future, and that will help set some context for all of the presentations and panels going forward. So for example, globalization, consolidation, the rise of the industrial internet, of which Peter was one of the primary kind of thought leaders during his days at GE, the competition for talent, and platforms now drivers of innovation. Peter, why don't you share with us some of the data that you've pulled together?
Sure. So we're going to do a sort of review of the last year, what's been happening, and identify some new themes that are emerging on the platform landscape. I thought I'd start with sort of what is the state of the largest platforms in the world. When you look at them from a market cap perspective, and I know there's a number of different perspectives that you can take on measuring platforms, but we see kind of a distinction between what I now call the super major platforms. These include the 7 largest platforms, and when you aggregate their market cap, they now hit $3.5 trillion in market capitalization. So they get a lot of attention, and I think everybody in the room knows them. You've got Apple, Google, Microsoft, what else? Facebook, and then you've got obviously China as well coming into the mix with Alibaba and Tencent. And then you've got the other platforms, and there are many of them, and they're very diverse. And as Jeff mentioned, they're now moving into new industries, so we're going to talk about that today. And if you take those others, so the remaining 43 of the top 50, still quite sizable. Now they have a market capitalization of 1.4 trillion. So I guess the point here is that they're becoming more important, not just as kind of an interesting new business model, but having a major impact from an economic standpoint and quite disruptive to the industries that they operate and the adjacent industries, because we see them now moving into new areas like automotive, for example. We can also take a look at this from a geographic standpoint. And so when we plot that, we find that the world is not evenly distributed in terms of platform businesses. And it's very heavily concentrated in the United States. Again, this top 50 platforms in the world. 75%, at least from a market cap standpoint, reside in the United States. And that's interesting because it's giving a lift in innovation, and lots of interesting new technologies are emerging, and disruptions are taking place in the United States, but also has implications for where that innovation is taking place and who may be capturing the benefits of those platforms. We look to Asia. Asia is very active in the platform space. China now has become an epicenter, and in fact, from kind of a size of a user base, you can't beat the platforms in China. They have a tremendous user bases, and they're innovating in ways. In fact, Beijing has become an epicenter for platform innovation and startups, so lots of activities happening there. I think, and we've mentioned this in previous conferences, kind of the interesting thing is what's happening with Europe. Europe obviously has got some of the largest companies in the world, and it's got a well-established track record of innovation, but from a platform perspective, they seem to be lagging, and so that's an interesting phenomenon, and I think that continues, but there's some interesting regulatory issues that are emerging as a consequence that we'll speak to. Another theme that's happened over the last year is increasing consolidation in the platform space. We've seen a lot of mergers and acquisitions. Last year, kind of one of the big ones, if you recall, was Microsoft buying LinkedIn. This year, kind of the big one that just happened recently, or the announcement of, is Amazon's acquisition of Whole Foods, and what that may mean for an industry that we don't typically look at so much, which is the grocery industry. But it turns out that is a very large industry. It's a $600 billion industry just in the United States, and it's ripe for disruption. So we're going to talk a little bit later today in our payments and platforms session about what it might mean for the grocery industry, and all of us have to eat on a weekly basis. And so there's some interesting implications there. Intel made an interesting acquisition earlier this year, Mobileye, which is a technology that helps with the driverless vehicles. And so we see some very interesting convergence and change taking place in the automotive industry, and that's illustrative of that. And there's a bunch of other kind of acquisitions. When you tally that up, we come with a number of about $36 billion in acquisitions year to date, and I'm sure there are going to be additional ones happening. So with that, let me turn it over to Jeff to talk a little bit about the regulatory landscape and some of the things that have been happening over the past year there.
Yeah, and this is really just a highlight, because I think there's an awful lot happening at the kind of regulator level, because you can no longer ignore the platforms. I mean, I think maybe 10 years ago, you could assume that that was sort of a Silicon Valley thing, and that was a digital and software stuff, but we bend metal and we make real things. And so we can kind of let that ferment along. But now, with the kind of dominance at the top of the market cap, I think platforms have become things that you can no longer ignore. So for example, Barcelona steps up on its curb on Airbnb. The German courts are ordering Facebook to stop collecting fine-grained data. South Korea blocking Google Maps. President Obama signing laws to make ticket buying bots illegal. India actually approving the ride-sharing apps. The United States Congress in March allowing the ISPs to sell fine-grained search data was an interesting one, and perhaps cutting in a different direction. Uber banned in Italy. Turkey banning Wikipedia. So now we're starting to see where these systems have a lot of interplay with the political systems. We've got the EU releasing its updated policy strategy, and we'll get to a little bit more. And then, of course, we had the recent fine for Google with a $2.7 billion fine for antitrust. And if you look and do a little bit of a deeper dive, this one's particularly interesting because the clock is ticking on the General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR. So in May of 2018, that's due to become in effect for the EU. And so this means that you might be subject to significant fines. There's now this notion of a right in your data, and then what that might mean in terms of compliance. Mm-hmm. There are increased consumer rights. There's actually now this notion of a narrow window where you become liable if you don't report data breaches. So no more do you sort of quietly solve the problems that are happening every day in the background, but now you actually have to report those and make that part of the public record. And there's a whole new class of general data protection officers that are going to be responsible for this. And if you kind of tally all of this up, it's very interesting because you might say, well, that's a lot of friction. And one of the kind of conversations that this group on the podium here has had with the EU Single Digital Market Commission is really around, are those frictions kind of creating some barriers that would allow for the growth of this sector of the economy? And I think these people have done a deep dive, and they're very aware of the issue, but I wouldn't necessarily say they've cracked the code in terms of how do you balance these rights in your data against the friction that those rights are placing on the growth of systems. It's fascinating that the EU and the US, particularly in the last, say, 6 months, appear to be kind of diverging. And that'll place some real challenges on firms that are operating on a global scale. So now you can see that they're going to have to put in the compliance systems internally that will allow for them to protect data in one area. And so you're going to have some real regional differences. And if you kind of play that forward, you can think of the platform services of compliance as being yet again an area where some of the larger ones will have a huge advantage because they can then supply those compliance kind of capabilities as a service. So there might actually be some ways that there are opportunities instead of just frictions that come out of this. So I think we're in early days, and these systems have fully emerged on the radar of the regulatory community, and we'll have more to say next year. Marshall?
Sounds great. Excellent. So I'll start with a question for you. Do you think being large is becoming a disadvantage at all, or do you think it'll be becoming an advantage as we move forward with the platform economy? Some of the more interesting data that we have to take a look at is what's happening in innovation and the innovation ecosystems. This is a plot of patents by several of the largest firms over time from 2010 to 2016. Some of them, like Microsoft, are already at an extraordinarily high level. Some of them, like Google, started somewhere around 450 and are now well above 3,000 patents a year. We take a look at Apple, has been rising. Intel Corporation is up. Facebook is now also becoming active. For reference, this data are taken from the top 300 patenting firms alone. So among those top firms, these are already standouts. So we actually see innovation taking place, perhaps even at an increasing pace. We'll come back to that in just a moment. But it's remarkable to see that this is a continuing trend among those firms that are already large and at the top. What's also interesting is the concentration of expertise in these expertise networks. To give you a couple of interesting data points on this, Kaggle recently passed 1 million. Does anyone know what Kaggle does? Right? Excellent. Okay, the folks from Google. Okay, yes, the folks from Google do know what Kaggle does. They just acquired Kaggle. It's machine learning competitions actually help you to analyze data. These are some of the best data scientists in the world, and they have just recently passed 1 million participants, 1 million registered folks. If you're looking at the best talent in the world, this is globally concentrated in places like Kaggle, and you can access it. And now we've got the data on that to show where it's going to be adapted in the future. For reference, yesterday, at the academic version of this, we got the first evidence that some of these developer conferences, this is directly for you, if you're running developer conferences or if you're trying to actually create more expertise and more concentrated development, we've got statistical evidence, strong and significant, these developer conferences are associated with increased output of the firm. So apps now, Jens Federer, was an academic, just presented yesterday these wonderful results that Apple, in sponsoring these large developer conferences, get increased numbers of apps downloaded, increased app development, and the differential benefit of the developers that participate in these ecosystems is higher than those that don't. So it's quite interesting that this competition for talent is heating up, and this will be one of the methods that you yourselves can use as you move forward in trying to develop your own expert networks, acquisition and developer conferences and others. We'll hear much more about that from Google later this morning. How about artificial intelligence? One of the most interesting elements of this, we asked a question at the beginning, what does it mean if you're already big? Is this going to help? Would you anticipate that you are then going to be able to get decreasing returns to scale, or is it going to be increasing returns to scale? This provides evidence of the latter. In fact, if you look here, these are the concentrations. Let's see if I can point this out for you. Do we have the laser pointer on this? No, I can go backwards and forwards. There it is. All right, these are concentrated in China, here, or in Silicon Valley. We've got Tencent, who'll be speaking today, Alibaba, Baidu, Naver, SoftBank. In the United States, it's Apple, Facebook, Intel, Amazon, Microsoft, Google. We have IBM Watson speaking, folks from IBM Watson speaking today, folks from Intel speaking today, folks from a number of outstanding for KPMG also speaking on artificial intelligence. This is where the big get bigger. This is where strength leads to strength. What happens is if you have the data, you can then train your AI systems, which improves your products, which increases the customer engagement, which gives you the data. It becomes recursive. It's a remarkable phenomenon where a concentrated number of firms are increasingly likely to become stronger and better. And it's quite interesting that folks will be using these systems to adapt their systems over time. So we'll be talking about that in some of the AI panels later this afternoon. But do notice the companies that are involved and how this is likely to be becoming increasingly concentrated in the United States and China. So some of the themes for today are exactly those. What is the role of platforms in national systems of innovation? As Peter was pointing out a moment ago, these are actually becoming extraordinarily important to what's happening in different countries, which of course is also going to impinge on the regulatory issues in this. Some of the regulatory issues are inadvertently restricting the data in ways that are limiting the network effect and limiting the scale, so countries are thinking that they're implementing well-intentioned policies, but in fact actually doing the opposite. That's something we're really going to need to think about. Another is this variation in the global distribution of platform wealth. The platform companies, as they become dominant in economies, are becoming stronger. They're becoming bigger data aggregators. And this initial distribution that's different can be even rising and increasing stratification, which then raises interesting questions about inequality in the long run, jobs in the long run, which companies are going to be controlling these in the long run. It goes to David's earlier point about what organizational structures should we be implementing if all of these transactions are occurring on someone else's platform as opposed to one that you own? Platform strategy, another interesting thing. For reference, I'm happy to mention we'll be teaching a free class on platform strategy on edX. Just look up platform strategy starting in September. So you'll be able, I hope we'll find some of you there. But this will also talk about the design, mergers, acquisition, globalization. Some of these things are truly different. How many of you would have predicted Amazon buying Whole Foods? Right? One of the interesting things about it is that classic economic theory uses things like RJR Nabisco. This was bought out by a leverage firm, KKR. They then sold off the parts and made more money than the company together. It was a conglomerate of food and tobacco companies. It didn't necessarily create synergies. The traditional view of M&A was where do you get product synergies or supply chain synergies. Clearly we have those in the Amazon acquisition of Whole Foods. You're getting logistics in the last mile. But think about it. You're also getting data synergies. You're getting increased data in scope. It's like feeling different portions of the elephant. One industry gives you a view of the customer profile in one element, but a completely different industry gives you a different portion of the elephant. If the only thing you're doing is getting data comparing Safeway and Whole Foods, that's still in the grocery industry. But if now you're also comparing their email behavior or their car and mobility behavior, you're getting a completely different view. And if the goal of a platform is to consummate the match, and you have a better understanding of your target customer, you can create more matches and create more wealth than the competition. It's a different view of platform strategy. So you look for the data synergies in addition to the product complementarity synergies. Then, of course, the next wave of this will be happening with artificial intelligence as we introduce more of these machine learning algorithms and introduce that with the platform strategies as well. It's quite remarkable what we should anticipate seeing in the future. So with that, I think let's open it up to questions. Yep. So if that doesn't happen, we'll ask each other questions. So.
Oh, you got a question.
Or we'll start calling on people.
Yeah, we got, yeah. Mark.
And do please state your name and affiliation.
Mark Bonchek with Shift Thinking. So my question is, it's a simple one. Why is Netflix a platform? I saw it on the chart.
So why would you think they wouldn't be a platform?
Well, to me, it's kind of the simple version of platform, which is it's digital distribution, but I don't really see them as a multi-sided market. They could be, like YouTube.
Actually, we'll agree with you that they're more potential, and what you would expect to see them do over time is to start to facilitate the distributed production of content. So they ought to have the ability for an independent producer to come, aggregate the talent, aggregate sort of the production resources, and then get that through. So I guess I would agree with you that there's a spectrum, and they're relatively more closed. And so it's really an issue of the open versus closed decision that every platform has to make. And arguably, I think they've got a lot of room to open up.
They could flip
Mark,
the switch.
let me introduce you to Mike.
No, yeah. Respectfully, dude, Netflix is a platform. It's a brilliant platform. It is a multi-sided platform. I have firsthand knowledge. Jeff, this is the first time you said something that surprised me in a negative way. You look at binge viewing, the analytics they do when they commission shows, that's the two-sided market. It couldn't be more analogous to the App Store with favored, both on the Google Play side and the App Store. Favored ones get insight into information. Who are the power users? Who are most likely to binge? What characters are most associated? Now, admittedly, one of the issues here is the difference between correlation and mechanism, and that's leading to different kinds of things that they are doing in funding and doing targeted shows. But both on the development side and on the distribution side, go to their, just for people here, go to their developer blog on how they've refined their recommendation engine. I agree with you, they're terrific in distribution and all of this, but the way they do recommendation, the way they track, one of the most interesting problems that they have is that they have recommendation engines for individual viewers, but how do people often view things? As couples. One of the big challenges they have is how do we come up with recommenders for families? So all of the most important platform questions they're addressing, and if you were to talk to, if Reed were here, he would go for your throat. No, he wouldn't do that.
So
Netflix is a platform.
But
So
the original point, though, is if you take the spectrum of openness, many of those things that you just discussed are still largely done internally. They are out.
Openness, as you define it, access and openness is, and now I'll pay the compliment to Marshall on one of the issues I hope we discuss. Access versus openness is a governance issue.
Absolutely.
And platform governance is, I hope, you didn't mention it as one of the themes, but I hope that's going to emerge as one of the most important topics of discussion here.
So
my apologies.
Let me add one thought, and actually thank you for the question. Because I want to thank you for the question because it highlights actually something that's quite deep. And I'll show you why, but on the basis of a short story. Because when the book first came out, almost all the reviews were great, except for one fellow in the New York Times actually said there are no network effects at Netflix, which really surprised me. But what was interesting is I think he genuinely deeply understood network effects. The reason is he was looking purely at connectivity network effects. You tend to think of the social network effects. What they miss is the deeper definition of users creating value for users. As an example of that, it's not just the direct value of user-generated content for other users. It is also the indirect value of things like machine learning, of recommender systems, exactly as that. It's also, by the way, it's openness, which allows you to capture more data inside this. The beauty of this is, think of what Netflix does with that data. Not only do they match you to a movie, they've done something brilliant. They take that data and they use it to design House of Cards. They can de-risk their content in a way. ABC can't do that, NBC can't do that. That's using user-created value for other users to create product, and that is a network effect, and I'll argue that's a platform.
I'd like to disagree.
Lightning question.
We've only got, we've got one question.
We got one more.
We've got
We have,
one
okay.
question that we've had
All
in
right.
6 minutes, so this is good conversation.
Absolutely. Yep, lightning round. Name and affiliation.
Very short. Alexis from Abilium, Slovenia. What about the blockchain technologies from the last year with the network effects and all this?
Peter, I think you've
Yeah.
done some work on this.
Yes or no? I would say it's early days. There's a lot of experimentation taking place, but I think the potential is obviously there.
It will be an example of externalization of transactions. As the accounting records of organizations move from inside to a public ledger, you will see more transactions, more value created outside the organization than from inside the organization. It will be less hidden, which will be these strong network effects. You will see more information sharing across it. It's going to be a very interesting technology.
3, 2, 1, time.
Thank you.
All right, so welcome everyone. Thank you for being here.
Where did my...